Okay, so what is mental fitness? And this is a very common definition of what mental fitness is. Competition is commonly defined as comparing oneself to others and putting your ego on the line in a setting bound by rules. So when I talk about competition in that way, right away it sort of sounds a little bit intimidating and starts to head us down the path of where we're coming from when we talk about mental fitness, okay? So what's important when it comes to understanding what happens on race day in competition, it's how the athlete sees the setting is what's most important here. So it's really little relevance of what the actual situation is. It's really more about how the athlete perceives the situation, okay? So the way I like to say that is how the athlete lets the setting they are presented with make them feel, okay? So as an athlete, you have control over that. You're able to change the way that you may perceive a certain situation. And again, really, it really doesn't matter what the actual situation is. It's really about how you as an athlete perceive the situation when we talk about mental fitness, okay? So athletes that are mentally fit, and that's the term I'm using here, have the ability to make any setting advantageous to them. So whether they're presented with a very competitive situation, a 50-50 shot competitive situation, or a very easy situation, they're able to manipulate how they let that situation make them feel so that they can show the fitness that they may have on race day. The difficulty we see with athletes that don't have this so-called mental fitness is, although they may have very, very good training metrics outside of race day, they may be totally prepared, they've covered all 4 of the so-called QT2 cornerstones, they arrive on race day and they're not able to have the race outcome, okay? That's a very, very difficult situation to be in, and that's really what we're targeting here tonight. So what's the difference between mental fitness and mental health? Okay, so mental health is really clinical in nature. This presentation is really not meant to address that particular. An example here is clinical depression or some of the other mental health, more clinically related terms to mental health. I'd like to think of mental fitness as a sport-related term, okay? However, these two things can certainly influence one another. So if you're dealing with an athlete who is not mentally healthy from a clinic standpoint, they are not able to create mental fitness. And I like to think of this very, very similar to physical fitness. You really don't have speed until you create physical health first, okay? Physical, systematic health is always more important. You really need to have that before you're going to create any speed. So the term here is physical health before physical fitness, and it's really the same thing with mental health. You need to create mental health before mental fitness. If you're a depressed person from a clinical standpoint, it may be very, very difficult for you to create mental fitness and really perform to your performance metrics on race day. So the takeaway is you must create health first, and that applies to both the mental and physical aspects to racing. So once mental health is achieved, the athlete can certainly work on mental fitness. Okay, so how do we identify that mental fitness may be a limiter to a particular athlete or to your own racing? So this is where we have the 4 QT2 cornerstones. They've all been covered by the athlete and very, very well executed on. But then they have a series of races where the performances definitely don't match what the expected outcome may be based on the training metrics. So, from a very direct, objective point of view, you say, okay, I've taken care of the training. I have great, great performance metrics. Maybe my 5K pace and my 20-minute power and my 800 time trial in the pool are the fastest they've ever been. I'm rested for the race. I've tapered well. I've carbohydrate loaded. I've fueled well on race day, and I've paced it very well. But I still just didn't get the race outcome. What happened? And that leaves athletes and coaches alike really scratching their heads, wondering what the heck happened. So when you have a series of races where this occurs, the first place that I start to look is this mental fitness and try to start addressing that and figure out what may be going on there. So why focus on mental fitness? In general, limiters in triathlon can occur in series and or in parallel with one another. I like to think of parallel limiters as sort of performance enhancers. So you already have a solid performance occurring, no major limiters, and you're working on items that will help improve that performance. So, an example here would actually just be your fitness. So, most athletes can go out there and they can race at a certain level. They go back home and they train a bunch and they come back and they race at a slightly better level. Those are limiters that occur in parallel. When I start thinking about limiters that occur in series, an example here would be race fueling. If you have a race fueling limiter, you're not able to handle your nutrition, it basically shuts down your day, and you're not able to show your fitness at all. So even though you've trained a whole bunch, you arrive at the race day unable to show that fitness because we have a series limiter here. And in this case, the example was fueling. But really, mental fitness falls into the same bucket. You can continue to make athletes, as a coach, continue to make athletes faster and faster in training every single year. But if they have a mental fitness limiter, you may show no improvement and even declining performance on race day, even though as a coach you've done everything you possibly can in training and you've improved the athlete on paper in every way that you can. So that's the difficult thing there, and that's why mental fitness is really, really important. So without a solution to the mental fitness issue, the other limiters that an athlete may have really have no consequence because the race never really depends on those other limiters being stopped by the mental limiter first, okay? So when mental fitness is the first series, it could render the available fitness almost useless on race day. Very, very difficult situation for, like I say, both coaches and athletes alike. Okay, so now we'll get into the meat of what we're talking about here. The first concept to understand is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation, this is basically the athlete's desire to be competent and self-determined, and this is typically fueled by their love of the game. This is what has athletes get up in the morning at 4 a.m., go out and train. It's the reason why all you guys are even on the webinar tonight. It's just sort of this burning desire to do sport, to do triathlon in this case. So most triathletes don't have much trouble with that. If I have an athlete, if I'm a coach and I've got an athlete that is having trouble with this, this is where I typically start to get concerned that there's a bigger picture issue related to physical health. Maybe they're overtrained and burnt out, haven't been taking care of the restoration stuff as much as they should be. Or there's a mental health issue. So you'll see here there's issues with health. So again, you can't create speed or fitness, either mental or physical, without creating health first. So if you start to lose this intrinsic motivation, there's probably a bigger picture issue like physical health or mental health, okay? So, you know, the last bullet under this topic is that athletes can be intrinsically motivated but lack mental fitness. So, you know, I've seen many, many athletes who are motivated to get up every morning. They get every single workout in no matter what because they want to do well at the sport. But they really don't have this mental fitness. They still arrive on race day extremely nervous and unable to perform on race day. Okay, so getting into extrinsic motivation, and this is really more reward-based, and this is where we're going to focus most of the presentation on tonight. Everything that I talk about from here is really extrinsic motivation. This is how the outside world and consequences of your actions and races affect you as an athlete and how you let those situations make you feel. And that's really what we have a lot of control over as athletes, and that's the most common area for issues with athletes, okay? So what is optimal mental fitness? Commonly defined as no fear of failure during activity or very limited fear of failure during the activity itself. No thinking about the performance while you're actually racing or even that much during race morning or preparation for the event. You know, you're really not thinking about outcomes all that much, I guess is the bottom line. You're more focused on the activity itself. So very, very narrow focus on the activity itself. And have the ability to have almost an involuntary experience on race day. This is where the athletes come across the finish line and you ask them, you know, why did you do that at mile 50 on the bike? I don't know, it just happened. And, you know, results in a very positive response, hopefully, potentially, on that particular race. So that's what we're shooting for, where things just happen and the athlete isn't really thinking a whole lot out there, okay, about outcomes in particular. And it's a very deep sense of personal control on race day where the athlete feels like they have control over their day, not the other way around. And the athlete's able to really control their arousal level. So the arousal level is sort of their excitement, that adrenaline rush you have before the gun goes off or at other points during the race. And the ability of the athlete to really control that. And this works in both directions. You can have athletes that are under-aroused and really need to try to get themselves psyched up, if you will, and athletes that are over-aroused to the point where it starts to undermine their day. And we're going to talk about that in more detail on a subsequent slide. So what does it boil down to? It's really thinking of task-relevant items only. So the whole purpose of mental fitness is to train yourself to be able to focus on only the task-relevant items versus the task-irrelevant items. So what mean here is, task relevant is what is my purpose out on race day? I'm out here to ride my bike, to ride my power, to ride my pace, to keep my heart rate in range, to keep a positive mental attitude as I race. Task irrelevant items would be, if I don't perform well, my friends are going to be upset at me. I'm going to not qualify for Kona. My family's going to be upset at me. They've traveled all this distance to come see me, and I'm going to disappoint them with my performance. So those are very task irrelevant items. So everything we talked about here tonight in terms of mental fitness is really focused on trying to have you think of only those task relevant items versus the task irrelevant items. So let's talk about athlete arousal a little bit. It's an important concept to help understand how things tie together with the mental fitness concept. As an athlete, we're trying to strike the arousal medium where it's not overdone and it's not underdone. Okay, so when athletes are under aroused, many times they're not able to push themselves to new physical bests. And we'll understand in, again, another subsequent slide, the types of athletes that sort of fall into this category versus the over-aroused category. But when athletes are over-aroused, they can begin focusing on task-irrelevant items like those I just discussed. It's very easy before a race for an athlete that gets over-aroused to start getting very nervous, maybe not be able to handle their race morning nutrition, because, and this, I'm just going to describe the negative spiral that occurs here, because they were unable to handle their race morning nutrition. They say to themselves, and again, it's how the athlete perceives the situation, but the athlete perceives that situation as a very detrimental situation. Oh no, I didn't get in 80 grams of carbohydrate with my breakfast like I was supposed to. Now I'm really not going to perform well. Well, now that increases the arousal level and leads to another one of those negative type occurrences. So you can see how things sort of spiral out of control fairly quickly when you have athletes that are over-aroused, and that's just one example. So for the athlete, harnessing their ability to ramp up or ramp down that characteristic is super, super important to having this whole thing work. So now getting into the generalizations of the two types of athletes that exist. In general, there are two types of athletes, and the first one are those who are motivated by the avoidance of failure. So the reason why they're out there and racing and why they're going to try hard on race day is so that in their mind they don't have to face their coach or their sponsors or their family or their friends after the race and say that I didn't do well. So that's what motivates them, the want to avoid those types of situations. Athlete number two are the ones that are motivated by the potential achievement of success, okay? These athletes are out there thinking, boy, this is a great opportunity for me to come out here and come in second place, or it's a great opportunity for me to come out here and show all of the training that I've done and show the great physical fitness that I have. So those are the two generalizations when it comes to types of athletes. No athlete is 100% one of these, but athletes usually fall somewhere in between the spectrum, either more to one side, more to the other, and some are right in the middle. And for some, it really depends on the day, it depends on the week, and it depends on the month. It depends on how training has went. So, as an athlete, you always need to assess where you think you are on this spectrum. And we're going to talk about the qualities of these two types of athletes and, how to deal with some of the qualities here to make it beneficial to the athlete, okay? So what we do know is that taking the same approach, again, as a coach, for all athletes, just like training itself, the same training program is not good for every single athlete. Training programs need to change dependent on the type of athlete that you're dealing with from a physiological standpoint. So just to show an example here, from a physiological standpoint, I could have an athlete that has a tremendous anaerobic capacity, and I may have another athlete who has a tremendous aerobic capacity. Two totally different types of athletes from a physiological perspective. The same training approach for each one of those athletes will not work as well for one as it would the other, or vice versa. It's the same thing here with the mental fitness approach. So we're going to talk about the first athlete here first, and here I'm talking about the MAF athlete. This is the athlete who is avoiding failure, and that's their motivation, okay? So these athletes typically do best if the event they're preparing for, the event they're racing on that particular day, is perceived to be very easy or very, very hard, okay? They tend to perform very well at the local sprint when the competition is weak. It really doesn't make them nervous. They don't perceive it as a threatening situation. or when it is very, very difficult. They just sort of go into it and say, the heck with it. It doesn't matter how I perform because I know I'm going to get beat anyway. And then they end up actually performing pretty well. And again, it's of very, very little relevance how the actual situation is. So when you deal with an athlete that is an MAF athlete, to tell them, what are you talking about? You have a great shot at this event. You have a 50-50 shot at the event. May not even help them because they're really perceiving it different than reality. So you need to think about how they're perceiving it and try to change their perception. And as an athlete, that's how you should think of it also. Say, how am I thinking of this event? And is there any way that I could change the way I'm perceiving the situation? What is reality here? For the MAF athlete, they tend to do better when the competition is very, very tough or very, very weak because they don't feel like they're putting their ego on the line at the end of the day, okay? So this athlete will typically not race very well if they're racing for a Kona slot at an average Ironman where they perceive their chance at getting the Kona slot as sort of a 50-50. They will not perform to expectations in that scenario. And again, the athlete isn't all an MAF athlete. They may be mostly an MAF athlete. So again, you need to think about who you are and how you perceive the situation. So continuing with the MAF athletes, these athletes can become easily over-aroused on race day and again start focusing on those task-irrelevant items such as my coach will kill me if this doesn't go well or my sponsors are going to drop me if I don't do well. The way to deal with this is to very quickly revert the thought process I guess what I'm trying to say here is that this athlete very quickly reverts themselves to a thought process of the environment is a threat to my self-esteem, and they start to perceive a disconnect between their actual ability level and what is required for success. Okay, so they create a scenario in their head where they just don't think they're fit enough to do well at that event. Or, if I'm dealing with the 50-50, which is the common scenario here, the athlete starts to set up in their head that their ability level isn't where it needs to be to win that 50-50, and it sort of puts them behind the 8 ball right off the bat, okay? So, again, and I've said this already, it's a fear of consequence from the outside world, okay? And that's the type of scenario we set up with the MAF athlete that doesn't do well, certainly in a 50-50. They tend to do better in the easier races or the very, very hard races. Now I'm going to talk about the MAS athlete a little bit. So this is the athlete that's motivated by that possibility of achievement, of success, okay, that MAS athlete. These athletes tend to do very, very well if they perceive the environment as a 50-50 shot. It sort of gets them aroused to an optimal point, sort of that happy medium spot where they're able to perform well but not start to focus on task-irrelevant items. They rise to the occasion and they take it as a challenge. So as a coach, when I deal with an athlete who's an MAS athlete, if the actuality of the event is that it's going to be a very, very easy race for them, I may set up a scenario where I try to create a 50-50 in their head as a way to try to raise their arousal level to get excited for the event. Because when these athletes go to an event that's not a 50-50 shot, they're not able to get excited or aroused. They're not able to show their physical fitness. So if I'm taking a very, very talented athlete who's just doing a local sprint triathlon where we want to test some of their physical ability, we sort of know that the athlete is going to win the event, but we really want the athlete to go there as a dry run, maybe to push new PRs and new physical bests, so on and so forth. Really need to try to set up a scenario where, hey, I've heard somebody else signed up for the race that may be pretty quick, and start to create some competitive atmosphere there that they may perceive as closer to 50-50 that gets them excited for the event, okay? So just to drive this home one more time, it's always about how the athlete perceives the race, not what the reality actually is, okay? So the MAS athletes tend to respond very well to detail in their training programs. This is another interesting topic that we're going to touch on here tonight. QT2 is very well known for very detailed quantitative training programs, and there's a lot of areas that we cover. Our coaching covers every facet of training and races that you could probably think of. This can work in both ways. So for the MAS athlete, the detail is actually quite good. They look at all of these metrics that we evaluate and all these numbers and things, and they take it as a challenge. They like seeing their workout results, so they compare it to a previous one, just like our coaches do. They see that all as a challenge, and they don't perceive it as a failure, as sort of a missed item or as a detriment. So they have an understanding that if they don't have their race morning applesauce at exactly 3 hours before the event, it's not going to have any difference whatsoever, so they don't take that as a failure. Whereas the MAF athlete perceives the fact that they didn't get in their applesauce exactly 3 hours before the event to the minute. They think of that as, wow, my day is over. I don't even stand a chance because I had my applesauce 5 minutes before I was supposed to or 5 minutes after. So you can see here what starts to happen. The detail in the training program is actually very, very good for the MAF athlete. But for the MAF athlete, sometimes too much detail can be detrimental. We'll talk about that too in a little while again. So the MAF athlete has that perspective. They're able to understand that, 0.5% impact items on race day are just that, 0.5% impact items on race day. Whereas the MAF athlete may perceive that 0.5% impact on race day item as a 20% impact on race day item and start to set up a negative mental atmosphere. So that's the difference between the MAF and the MAF athlete when it comes to detail in the training program. So caffeine is an interesting one, and this is not one you see talked about very often when it comes to the mental topic in athletics. But I think it's quite relevant, and here I'm going to talk about caffeine for the enhancement or the avoidance of detriment to mental fitness on race day. So most people think of caffeine as a physiological aid on race day, and there's been plenty of studies now that show that it certainly is. But nobody really talks about the mental impact of taking a drug like caffeine on race day. All right. So caffeine has the ability or the potential to undermine a performance on race day from a mental perspective. This certainly needs to be considered. So just running through an example here, the addition of caffeine for the MAF athlete, again, this is the one that's avoiding failure, can certainly overshoot the arousal medium. So these athletes are typically over-aroused already. So if you have an MAF athlete that's at an event that's a 50-50, they are extremely nervous already. That's where they don't do well. They perceive that their fitness isn't at the ability level required for success. So they're already very aroused. If we add caffeine into the equation, it really overshoots that arousal level and then creates that negative spiral that we talked about. It has the possibility to do that for sure. Caffeine intake may not be as simple as, well, it's a physiological ergonomic aid, therefore you should take 200 milligrams per pound, whatever, so on and so forth, and take it at every single race. Maybe we should look at the type of athlete that we're dealing with and change the caffeine dosing, and also dependent on the race environment that they're actually going for on that particular day. Okay? So how can caffeine be used as a tool when it comes to this mental fitness? If I look at the MAS athlete, caffeine can actually be used in situations where they are under-aroused. So this is the MAS athlete, again, who's just going to the local sprint where they perceive it as a very, very easy day for them. They're going to win for sure. You can use caffeine as a way to bring up the arousal level for that athlete so that we can test physical best and use the day as a test set maybe as we want it to be. Okay? So the takeaway on that one is to really think about the type of athlete that you are and how you perceive the event, and monitor or manipulate your caffeine dosage based on that fact. Okay. So next we're going to talk about the support environments. And when I talk about support environments, it's really how your coaches treat you as an athlete, how your family treats you as an athlete. And I call these support systems. And generally, athlete support systems fall into two categories. They are typically either very positive in nature, using positive reinforcement to help motivate the athlete, and honestly, again, this is very, very similar to the types of athletes we talked about earlier, but most support systems fall on the scale in between these two bookends, somewhere in the spectrum. Usually support systems aren't all of one or the other of these, but the second one is the use of punishment. So plenty of support systems, I shouldn't say plenty, but some support systems do use the punishment model. So just to talk about some examples here, for the positive reinforcement model, the athlete does very, very well on race day. They come back to their family or their coach, and the coach says, you did great. You really showed your physical ability out there. Great, great job. Or even if they didn't perform well, the coach really focuses on the goods of the day. So even if the athlete was an hour behind expectation at Ironman, the coach will try to pull out the things that they actually did very, very well on race day. And the families are typically a little bit better in that direction in terms of being more towards the positive reinforcement model. they'll always try to, well, I shouldn't say always, but most of the time, take the athlete and try to have the athlete pull out the positives from the day, okay? So that's one side. The other side is the punishment model, and this is where the coach says, you know, you really didn't do what we talked about. The reason why you didn't do well is because you didn't try hard enough and really use a lot of punishment to try and motivate the athlete, okay? And in general, you know, either coaches and support systems have one model that they use for all athletes. And really the model that you should use as a coach or the model you should use as a support system should really vary dependent on the athlete, okay? So, and these last two bullets here are a little bit more of my own opinion, but in general, you know, 99% of the situations, the positive reinforcement model is certainly the most productive. And I've seen a lot of different approaches to this and the way other groups run their support environments and the way they try to motivate athletes. And honestly, over the long term and for the health, again, the mental health and mental fitness of the athlete, most of the time the positive reinforcement model is a better approach for the most part. Now, you know, that's not to say that as a coach I'm always 100% on the positive reinforcement model. There's certainly some of the punishment model in there, but it's sort of used very sparingly depending on the situation. And it also depends on the type of athlete. So that's where I address this last bullet. So method number 2, which is the punishment model, can be more applicable to the MAS athlete. Again, that's the athlete that is motivated by the potential achievement of success. So these types of athletes, let's say I have a very MAS athlete who has a poor workout. I can talk to that athlete and say, listen, the reason why you didn't do well is because you didn't try hard enough. Next time you just need to do better, and hang up the phone. Okay, it sounds kind of harsh, but for the MAS athlete, they view that now as as sort of a competitive situation that has them want to challenge it and rise to meet that expectation. So they view that as a challenge and they rise to the occasion. Next workout will be much, much better. For the MAS athlete, okay, you use that same exact approach of that punishment model in the same exact situation for an athlete that's an MAF athlete. It right away gets them more focused on the task irrelevant items. Next time they go out there to do the workout, they're going to say, boy, last time I did this, my coach was so mad at me that I just have to do better this time so he's not as mad at me. Instead of the MAS athlete who says, you know, my coach was really mad at me, I'll show him that he was wrong, and this time I'm going to absolutely crush these intervals. So you can see the difference between the two different types of support environments and how the MAS or the MAF athlete can respond to it differently. So for the most part, the positive reinforcement approach is the way to go, with the punishment model mixed in, sort of sprinkled in sparingly, and the amount of it that you use really needs to be dependent on the type of athlete that you're dealing with. Okay, so what are some strategies? And I'm sure most of the people that are on this webinar and call tonight are already thinking about what type of athlete they may be. They've probably thought about 3 or 4 of their friends and what type of athletes they are. So, you know, how do we take what we've learned here tonight and use it to our advantage? So for the MAF athlete, what we've learned is we need to be cautious of applying too much detail or structure in the daily program. Now, of course, at QC2, we're still going to be applying quite a bit of detail in the training program, but as an MAF athlete, you need to take it into perspective and be careful not to think of a lot of the stuff we put forward as 20% impact items when they're really only 0.5% impact items. So if you find yourself starting to stress out because your workout was 56 minutes and we had scheduled 58, then you're probably going a little overboard. So just try to take things in perspective as an MAF athlete. And, you know, the most important thing here is if you have an MAF athlete who you believe is having mental fitness issues that are actually limiting their races, we really try to get away from detail as much as possible in the training program, as much as practical, as long as it's not physiologically undermining their ability, to the point where they're not worried about that stuff and not perceiving those 0.5% items as 20% items, and get that mental limiter out of there so that we're actually showing physical fitness on race day. Once you do that repetitively, you start to build a more positive atmosphere. Then, of course, you could always come back and sharpen the pencil and go back to that deep, deep level of detail. Because really, at the end of the day, that level of detail is the correct thing. And from a physiological perspective, is the difference between winning gold or silver at the Olympics. So it's certainly correct. The problem is with the MAF athlete, it's sort of too much too soon, and they perceive the environment as very threatening, and they start to perceive small missed items as very, very big, devastating things. And it sort of undermine their ability to race before they even arrive at the starting line. Okay. So for the MAF athlete where arousal can get out of hand on race day, we really try to only use caffeine when the environment is perceived to be way, way easier than a 50-50. So this athlete needs to be totally comfortable with the day, thinking that they have no problem in winning the event or doing very, very well at the event. Okay, so that's where we would use caffeine in that case. The use of positive reinforcement from the support system should definitely be encouraged. So if you're an MAF athlete and you have a coach or a family who uses a little bit more of the punishment model, go back and ask them, say, hey, I really take what you say to me as a detriment, and I think it's starting to undermine my performance. Could you try taking more of a positive reinforcement model? And, that'll sometimes go a long way, especially if you say it to your family. And most coaches take that very well also. So for the MAF athlete, you should always be trying to revert your thoughts back to task-relevant items. So on race day, if you find yourself worried about this, that, and the other thing and consequences of the day, always do your best to try to come back and focus on those task-relevant items. A good way to do that is to really review your training success and say, yeah, I could do this. I had all these great things happen to me in training. I know I'm in a good spot here, and try to create more of a positive atmosphere. Okay, so here we're going to talk about the MAS athlete. Okay, so this is the athlete who is motivated by the potential achievement of success. Okay, here we want to focus on getting the arousal up for any of the non-50-50 races. So if it's a race where they feel they have no chance, or especially if it's a race where they feel like they're going to win without a problem or do very, very well without a problem, they may not even be excited for the event. And I've seen this happen many times where the athlete wakes up, or I see him in transition in the morning, and they say, I don't know, I don't even feel excited. I don't know, I don't even feel like I'm racing yet. In those situations, really need to work on trying to get the arousal level up so that we can at least perform to our physical best. That's why we're out there racing in the first place, of course. So find something in the race that motivates you. And as a coach, I'll do this with my athletes as a pre-event talk, and think about if there's someone in that race that they've raced against before who they don't like even. It sounds crazy, but maybe somebody that they just don't like, and I know that as a coach. I'm going to tell that athlete that, hey, listen, so-and-so's racing, and they told me the other day they were going to beat you, and, even if the athlete takes it as a joke, it sort of sticks in there, and it's something that'll help motivate them and get that arousal up on race day, all right? And the other sub-bullet there is, of course, using caffeine to help get the arousal up for these MAS athletes on the non-50-50 races, okay? So, again, in most cases, detail is very good in the training program. For the MAS athlete, you could really dig in and apply a lot of detail to the training program. They view it as a challenge, and they really step up to the task and really do very, very well with that detail. So, again, for these athletes, the MAS athletes, some use of the punishment model can be extrinsically motivating. Again, they're gonna view that as a challenge. If I come at them as a coach and say, hey, you just didn't try hard enough. That's why your watts were too low. What happened to you out there? When are you going to start trying? They say, okay, yeah, you want to say that to me? The next time I'll show you that I can do this workout a lot better, and I could really overshoot what you ever thought I could do. So the MAS athlete takes it as a challenge, all right? And, when all else fails, if you feel like it's really still a limiter on race day, there's some really good sports psychologists out there that can be a big solution. And I've had some athletes that I've certainly referred to sports psychologists and some that I know, and we've had very good results in those cases many times. So, here's our goal-setting process at QT2. How do we manage our thoughts on race day? And really this applies to the micro level on race day, but it also applies throughout the season. So I'm going to talk about it here mostly applied to race day and how you're managing things that are going through your head. So first thing is what we call goals. So examples here are that you're going to be tough on race day, you're not going to give up no matter how hard things get, you're going to follow the pacing plan, and you're going to follow the fueling plan. So this is the athlete's sort of dialogue, mental dialogue during the race, okay? So these are best described as the items in which the athlete has 100% control over. So what I like athletes to do is really start at the top of the list. Really, you'll notice, let's just peek down, right? If I look at the bottom, I've got outcomes. So, if you have an athlete that starts to focus on outcomes very, very soon in an event, or really at all during an event, we really want them to revert back to the goals first, okay? Am I being tough? And do I have a positive atmosphere? These are the things you have 100% control over. So the athlete needs to master that mantra, and that's our first priority, our goals, okay? And that's happening on race day in real time while we're out there racing. Once the athlete has those mastered, then they can move down to targets. So here, examples are the average, 250 watts on the bike. I'm going to run 7 minute and 45 second pace on the run. How am I doing relative to my targets? And these are items you have a little bit less control over, but are certainly directly related to the training. And, especially with QT2, as we put out pacing plans, these are very, very accurate metrics. These are numbers that should be very attainable for you and predicted very closely based on the training that you've done. So first, we get down our goals, make sure we're creating the right mental atmosphere, being tough, being positive, so on and so forth. Then we move to our targets. What's my wattage? What's my heart rate? What's my pace? And lastly, we start to think about outcomes. And honestly, for most age groupers in Ironman racing, we don't even think about outcomes maybe to the last half mile of the run. Up until that point, it's totally irrelevant. So here I'm talking about age group, overall placing, race time, Kona qualification. These are the items you have the absolute least control over, and these are really just an outcome of the previous two buckets. So too many times I see athletes with this exactly flipped around. So if you talk to them the day before the event, you say, hey, what are your goals for tomorrow? I'm going for a Kona swap. That's not the correct way to be thinking about things. It sets you up, in most cases, for failure on race day, especially in the long events like Ironman. The athlete gets out there, and right away, they do their swim. They come out of the water. They peek at the clock. They were expecting to swim 1:08, and it came out at 1:11. So they look at it, and they say, oh, no, I'm already behind. I'm not going to get my Kona swap. Then they get on the bike, and instead of sticking to their pacing plan, their targets that they've set up with their coach, they overpace the early portion of the bike because they notice their friend Joe is ahead of them, who they're usually ahead of. So they start to overpace the day because they're focusing on outcomes. And you can see that how that really starts to impact the day. And they're not even going to race as good as they could have had they paced it properly. So thinking about outcomes early in the event, or really at all during the event, is really not a good approach. The only time we think about outcomes is if we're racing at the professional level, with an extreme amount of durability and race experience, and we're able to take those risks. But at the age group level, and even at the pro level, in most cases, it's really focusing on the goals first, the things we have 100% control over, target second, outcomes absolutely last. And that's just a great, great way to manage your thoughts on race day. And honestly, that works very, very well for both the MAF and MAS athlete. Probably a little bit more relevant for the MAF athlete, but certainly relevant for both. Okay, so the priority should be at the top of the list in all cases. So at the end of the day, that's what it looks like when it comes together. That's everything I had put together for the formal presentation here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and look at the chat, answer questions there. I'm going to go ahead and open up the audio for everyone right now, so we can have a little open Q&A. Okay, I had a question. Given that many or most MAF and MAS, how do we handle and walk the line? That's a good question because, as I give the presentation, it's very easy to interpret what I've talked about here, that athletes fall into distinct buckets here. And I did mention this, but honestly, they certainly don't, and they're somewhere in between, and it varies on a weekly basis. It varies depending on the event. If you're dealing with an MAF athlete and you work with them for a whole season, a lot of times the next season you've created more of an MAF, which is certainly a better atmosphere in most cases. I'm just going to go ahead and mute somebody. Okay. So, you really need to think about where you are in the spectrum at any different point in time and manipulate the support system and a lot of the external factors that I talked about, depending on where you fall. So it really depends on the event that you have coming up, where you are in the season, and sort of always doing a self-assessment on where you are and understanding the symptoms of either one of these and how to deal with them. So if you're generally, let's say, an MAS athlete, but there's an event that's coming up that's, sort of a competitive event, and you're starting to perceive it as an event where you don't have the physical ability. And again, you're perceiving it this way. It may be different from reality, but you're perceiving that you may not have the physical ability to succeed at that event, whatever success may be. And you start to think about the test irrelevant items. Well, then you say, okay, well, for this athlete, I'm certainly starting to think like an MAF athlete. So what are the things I could do that we've talked about here tonight to try to revert my thought process? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks very much.
No problem. Are there any other questions right now that I can help answer? I think we had some minor slide issues up front, but I don't believe that we missed any content up front. A question just popped up. Do we see athletes commonly change over time? And that's sort of what I was just discussing with the last question. But we certainly see athletes change over time. And, my objective as a coach is if I'm dealing with an MAF athlete, is to try to, set up their days to be more positive and start to change them over the long term more towards an MAS athlete. Typically, the MAS athletes are a little bit easier to work with and really have less in most cases. Now, there's other cases, but that's sort of the generalization there, if I can make one. Okay, I had a question here that if participants don't have any more questions, can I redo the first few slides? The audio wasn't working, and I certainly can do that. So here was the first slide, and it was discussing the typical 4 QT2 cornerstones, and they really consist of training and nutrition as our first 2, and those 2 come together as our preparatory activities. Third one is race fueling. Fourth one is race pacing, and these 2 come together to form our execution activities. So those are the traditional 4 QT2 cornerstones. And in general, the way we've always described it is as long as you take care of all 4 of these buckets with equal attention, you will get your race outcome. And what tonight's presentation was really about is the so-called 5th cornerstone, mental fitness, because you can really take care of the first 4 here and not get the race outcome. And that's always the most frustrating thing as an athlete or a coach. So tonight's presentation was really about trying to address this 5th cornerstone and as a possible series limiter. So then we defined what mental fitness was. Competition is very commonly defined as comparing oneself to others and putting your ego on the line in a setting bound by rules. So when it's described that way, and that's sort of the textbook definition, you can see how it can be very intimidating for athletes. So the key is how athletes perceive the situation. So how the athlete lets the setting they are presented with make them feel is the absolute key to mental fitness. So that's where the athlete has the ability to manipulate how they let that setting make them feel, and that's what we're talking about here. Okay. So with that, the situation that actually is really is of little relevance. Okay, I got a message on the chat that was all we missed in terms of the audio up front. I apologize for that little audio issue. Were there any other questions? I see another one here. How and when should this conversation occur? So do we encourage coaches and athletes to talk openly about their mental fitness, whether they MAF or MAS? Absolutely, especially if you feel that a coach that you have isn't quite judging the way that you perceive things correctly. It's only going to help both of you if you're able to tell your athlete what sort of motivates you and things that don't work for you. The more the coach knows about that, the better they're able to serve you, and the better you'll perform at the end of the day. And that's all coaches want, right? All coaches do what they do to have athletes perform well. So in the cases where there's a complete misunderstanding by the coach of what actually motivates the athlete or what type of athlete they're actually dealing with, when there's a mismatch like that, The relationship will go on for some period of time, but it will ultimately fall apart because the athlete is just not getting motivated the way they should be. A lot of times it may even be a detriment, and they're spiraling in the wrong direction. And eventually there's some buildup of frustration there by the athlete, and it's all over. And that's been my experience with it, so I would certainly recommend talking to your coach about that. Are there any other questions? Okay, if there are no other questions at this time, I'm going to thank everybody for attending this webinar tonight. We'll have it posted in the QT2 member area probably by the end of the day tomorrow if anyone would like to rewatch it. And as always, if anyone has any suggestions on future webinars they would like us to touch on and actually execute on, just email the QT2 services address, services@qt2systems.com, and we'll be sure to get it up there. We're going to continue to try to do these about once a month. So I appreciate the attention, and I'm sure I'll see all of you soon.
So people can call in their phone and they can hear it?
Mm-hmm.
But then how do they not see it? I mean, how do they see it?
They can't, I wouldn't think, unless maybe they also have, like